Hello, everyone. Welcome to History at Home tonight. Tonight's topic is Newark's lost buildings. Let me go ahead and get us started here. My name is Corey Stutes. I'm the Museum Curator at the Works, and I'll be taking care of your presentation today. If you've been a guest of any of my History at Home presentations in the past, I really want to say thank you for continuing to support these presentations. If you're new, welcome. I'm really excited that you've chosen to join us tonight. Tonight's presentation will run about an hour long. With that said, I think I have 90 slides in this presentation, so I will do my best to keep it as on time as I possibly can. If it happens to run over, you're welcome to stay, or if you need to duck out, that's fine. This presentation is being recorded. So if you miss any part of it, if anyone that you know didn't get a chance to join the live presentation, it will be posted on our YouTube channel. It will also be posted on our Facebook. So our social media outlets, as well as our YouTube page, are a good place to head to find the recording of this presentation. So it will be available to be seen after the fact as well. If you are joining me live tonight, though, you do have the opportunity to ask questions. I sent everyone a chat. I'm not sure, those of you who joined afterwards, if you got it or not, but please familiarize yourself with the Zoom controls if you haven't already done so. I think by this point, we're all probably pretty familiar with Zoom, but if you're still a newbie to it, you can type a chat. There's a chat box where you can ask questions. You're welcome to ask questions during the presentation. I'll do my best to see those pop up and try to answer them as they come in. But if I do miss any, I will go back through just to make sure that I can answer any questions at the end of the presentation that I might have missed during it. Again, today's presentation is called Newark's Lost Buildings. So we'll be focusing on buildings in generally the downtown area that have been torn down. Some of them you will have known. There are some familiar ones, and then there are others that maybe you haven't seen or you forgot about, or you might learn something new about. So if you have any questions at all, I welcome your questions. Any comments, memories, anything like that is always great to share. And like I said, I'll do my best to address those questions as they come in. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my video off just so that you aren't looking at me the whole time. And everyone should be able to see the slide that says Newark's Lost Buildings. If you have any problems or issues seeing something or hearing something, again, let me know in the chat function and I will see if there's anything that I can do to help. And with that, let's go ahead and get this show on the road. So we can't really talk about buildings that have been lost in Newark without starting right at the center of Newark and talking about this building, which if you don't recognize it right off the bat, you can probably figure out what it is. This is the previous Licking County Courthouse. In fact, this was the third courthouse that was in this in the center of town. This courthouse was built in 1835. It replaced a smaller brick, two-story brick structure that had been built on the site around 1815. That brick structure had replaced the original log courthouse / school / multi-use building. By the time they built this building in 1835, Newark had seen the completion of the Ohio and Erie Canal, and its economy was well on its way, seeing a lot of growth during this point in time in the mid-19th century. So they needed a courthouse that was befitting of that. This building was much larger than the one that was there before. As you can see, it's pretty grand. There are columns on either side, on facing west and facing east. The columns were made out of blackhand sandstone that were locally quarried. The Greek Revival design was pretty indicative of other government buildings, sort of lent an air of authority. However, it wasn't as popular as you might think. There were some mixed reviews about the building. A lot of community members felt that it was maybe a little bit too expensive, too fancy, wasn't fitting of the then still small town that Newark was. However, of course, we know Newark continued to grow. Newark continued to boom throughout the 19th century, and then again at the turn of the 20th century, and saw several periods of pretty extensive population growth. So the courthouse was sort of a harbinger of what was coming in Newark. Here we can see another view of it from a different angle. You can really tell that the square at this point in time was turned into sort of a park. Before this, there had been other buildings that were on the square. If you caught one of my previous presentations about churches, you will have learned that Newark's first church was also on the square, as well as the courthouse. When they built this new courthouse, they made it a rule that no other buildings could stand on the courthouse square except for the courthouse. And they really made this land sort of the property of the people, made it a park where people could come and just enjoy being. There are a lot of walkways and it looks pretty neat, lots of trees. However, this courthouse was not meant to last very long. So it was only around for about 41 years. And in 1876, a disaster happened and it caught fire. So this building was completely pretty much destroyed. The roof was fully gone, walls collapsed. So it was pretty much reduced to rubble due to the fire. And the current courthouse that we have, which it's hard to get a good picture of these, you'll see several Google pictures. These are from Google Street View. And the trees sort of block it, but I would imagine we're all pretty familiar with our courthouse now. But the current courthouse was built in its place. Construction on this one lasted from 1876 until it opened in 1878. So I'd say we're all pretty familiar with that. There will, like I said, there will be some buildings that you will recognize, and there will probably be some buildings that you didn't recognize in this presentation. Another well-known building is this one, the Auditorium Theater. Again, I did a presentation on theaters, so I did go find that on our YouTube channel. It is available to see if you haven't already seen it. So I will give some brief details on this. This was another municipal building. So this was not a private building, it was public. It was owned by the county commissioners, and it was originally built as a soldiers and sailors memorial building. So this was to memorialize any of the military men that had been involved in wars up until that point. The cornerstone for this building was laid on June 11th in 1894. It housed some rooms and business space and things in the front. And then there was a very large theater space in the back. You can really tell the scale of this building is pretty immense. And it was a really grand building, especially for Newark. So this is just a very impressive piece of architecture. And someone just asked a question, what happened to the columns from the old courthouse? So some of the column pieces did survive, and it's a great question as to where they are now, because there are pictures, and I don't know whether all of them, what happened to all of them. There were 6 columns on either side, so there were a total of 12 columns. And we have seen there are pictures where people or a person used one of the capitals of one of the columns as a lawn ornament and pieces of the columns as lawn decorations. But those pictures are over 100 years old. So I have asked a lot of people, and I am familiar with a lot of people who have been wondering the same thing as to what happened to those columns. And the answer is that nobody really knows for sure where they are right now. There's a good chance that some of them, pieces of them, maybe all of them, who knows, might exist, but we just don't know where. So if anybody has a clue, there's a lot of times when people will have something and they know what it is, but they either don't want somebody to know that they have it, or they just never think that it's that important. So if you happen to have something in your yard, or you know somebody, it could just be that it's been in a family for a long time and nobody nobody's walking around town telling people that they've got it. So I don't know for sure, but I do know that pieces of them did survive long after the courthouse was cleared away and the new one was built. But that's a great question. Thank you. All right, so back to the auditorium. You can see this theater was very great. You can tell from this view how it sort of towered, and it really dominated the downtown landscape. There really weren't any other buildings quite like it in Newark. It's got a huge central dome with statues of the Three Graces on top. There were originally statues of soldiers that were placed on it. The statues had all been removed. Actually, in the 1950s, there was a storm that blew off statues of the soldiers, and those are now available to see. I think they're at the VFW on display there. The statues of the Three Graces do still exist in there in a private collection as well. If you were lucky enough to come to the Licking County Architecture Show that we had at the Works a few years ago in the gallery, I think it was in 2018, we actually had one of the statues from the top of the auditorium. So it was really cool to get to see that. However, this building was just really magnificent. You can see a later picture of it. However, unfortunately, on April 29th, 1968, it suffered a really devastating fire. The fire broke out inside the auditorium. Someone had gotten in and set a fire, and it essentially ruined the front of the building. So it didn't destroy the entire theater. It just destroyed the front. So they ended up demolishing the front and rebuilding it in more of a modern style. And this isn't a great picture, it doesn't show the entire front, but this is essentially what they replaced it with. So many of you probably remember this if you've lived in Newark for 25, 30 years. You will remember this from downtown. Some of you might remember the old facade too. Like I said, it was in 1968 when it burned. So quite a few of you probably remember that as well if you've lived in Newark or grew up in Newark. Eventually, though, the Auditorium Theater fell into disrepair. It was purchased by Dave Longaberger in the 90s, who also purchased the Midland Theater and planned to save both of them. He wanted to renovate them. He thought that the Auditorium Theater would be a great place to hold things for Longaberger employees, different events like that, as well as for the community. However, he had, in 2001, he had an estimate done to renovate the building, and the estimate came back at $25 million. I think part of that was because he wanted to replicate the original facade, which I can only imagine would have been exorbitant, but there were also a lot of issues with the heating and the HVAC system, and I'm sure a lot of other things. So eventually this building, it was deemed unable to be saved, so it was finally torn down in 2002. And this is what the space looks like today. The Licking County Foundation is now on that site. There's sort of a little park in the front where the auditorium building was. So that one was around until not that long ago. So you might remember some part of it. But again, it's a famous one that we have lost to time. Looks like we've got another question here. Oh, no. That one's the one I already answered. All right. So the next one you will probably recognize. Again, this is the Newark Trust, which was later also called the Central Trust. This was dubbed Newark's skyscraper. This building was multiple stories. I think it was maybe 9 stories. And it was built around 1906 to 1908. And it was home to the Newark Trust Company, which was a bank, as well as many offices. Eventually the Central Trust. Here are some pictures of it. There were a lot of pictures of it. It was a really central scene in Newark. There are a lot of postcards that feature it. because it was a pretty impressive building. It was very tall. You can see next to it is a little bit shorter of a building. That's called the Hall Building. It was built by Eli Hall. That one's still standing. So you can still see that one downtown. But the Newark Trust was older than it and taller than it. It was older than it by a couple of years. Sadly, the Newark Trust stood for about 80 years. And eventually, the Central Trust was needing to update the building, and it had come to a point where it didn't have, I think it didn't have sprinklers, it didn't have air conditioning and modern things. It was going to really be a lot of money to upgrade that. And as well, I heard that there were some structural issues where it had possibly been sinking. So the decision was made. The bank moved next door into the Hall Building, and they demolished the Newark Trust. They did build a side atrium where the trust was, and you can see there in that gap. Eventually, the Central Trust was bought by Unizan. I'm not sure if there were any steps in between, but I know that it was at some point became Unizan and then Chase Bank. Of course, Chase Bank is no longer there in that building anymore, but it is still occupied, the whole building is. However, the Newark Trust, which was Newark's famous skyscraper, was torn down 1987 or 1988. So a lot of you might remember that. Some of you might have worked in it. I hear a lot of interesting stories from people that worked in it. It was certainly an impressive building. So let's start getting to some that maybe aren't as recent and that not as many of us would remember. So this one, I can guarantee nobody remembers this building as it was. This is the Buckingham House, which was a hotel on the square, on the east side of the square, and opened in the mid-1860s, I think around 1864. It was one of many hotels in the downtown Newark area. I mentioned a little bit earlier that in the 1830s, we saw the completion of the canal, and that led to a huge rise in people coming in through and to Newark. So whether you are a worker coming for work, whether you're just shipping something on the canal, whether you're a traveler, no matter what, you're going to need a place to stay. Day trips were much less common since it took a lot longer to travel places. So a lot of the time you needed to spend the night somewhere. So this was one of many hotels in downtown Newark. You can also see there's some retail space. It says Kane and Dean, groceries, flour, and feed there on the bottom. So this was on the corner of 2nd Street and East Main Street. Today, it's the site of Wendy's downtown. This stood as it is in this picture for around 25 years. And then eventually in 1889, it was purchased by a man named Frank Warden. And he greatly expanded the building. As you can see, he added another floor, and it expanded to the east and to the south. And he built what would become the Warden Hotel. It was probably downtown Newark's largest hotel, one of the most well-known. It was a popular social spot as well. They had rooms where companies and people and individuals would use for parties. They had the Carnation Room, which was a dining room. They had the Tally Ho Tavern. Here's a picture of the Carnation dining room. So it was a popular spot. An interesting thing, though, with the Warden is that there was also a legend that surrounded it. And this is the legend of the Mason's Trowel. You might have heard this story from me before, if you've seen any of my other presentations. And the story goes that when it was being expanded in the late 1880s, they were adding on a 4th floor, and one of the stonemasons was working in that 4th floor window on the corner when he accidentally fell, falling to his death on the sidewalk. So as a way to memorialize him, the story says that his coworkers took his trowel and they placed it in the wall. Now, it was a popular thing to drive around and try to spot the trowel, and you could in fact see the trowel. But the mystery remained as to who put it there, how it got there, why it was there. Was it really from a dead Mason? And this legend lasted for a few decades. In the 1930s, I found an article that started to really speculate its origins, and they had spoken to a construction worker who had worked on the building and said, well, no, I helped do that and nobody died. But around the same time, somebody did die in a different building, which partially collapsed while it was under construction in a different part of town. So maybe there was some confusion there. And then later on, when the building was being torn down in the 1960s, they came to discover that, well, there was in fact a trowel on there on the corner, but it wasn't an actual tool trowel. It was made out of brick. So it was a brick formation in the shape of a trowel that had been molded to look like a trowel, and they were on the side of the building. So the mystery really continued because there was no clear explanation for why that had happened. And by that point, the construction, the expansion of this building was around 70 years ago. So there really weren't many people left that had worked on it that could remember and knew clearly why that happened. So the mystery did continue. It eliminated maybe some of the eeriness from it, but it was a popular story. And I think it's interesting to tell anytime we talk about the Warden Hotel. As you can see, it's the white portion there on the corner. It's pretty big. This is a photo from the 1960s, I think 1967, and it's from the courthouse. So you can see there were several buildings there, all of which pretty much are gone. Today, we've got Wendy's and we've got the county administration building. The Warden block, as it was called, butted up next to the Jones block, which is this building here in the center, which was home to Evans Drug Store. It was also home to the Meyer and Lindorf department store for several years. Just on the other side of that was the Oriole Building, which some of you might remember the Park Bar. This photo is a little bit grainy, but you can see the Oriole Building there, sort of to the left of center. A small alley, and then there's a building with a sort of spire on it, and that was the former Elks Lodge before they moved to the old Swisher Mansion, which was on the site of where the Elks still are today. And then next to that, you can see an old post office. So this was the location of the Newark Post Office 2 post offices ago. Of course, we are probably all familiar with where it is now on East Church. Before that, they were in their location on East Main Street in First, which is now the Skylight Ballroom. Before they built that building in 1920, they were located here on 2nd Street. So of course, all those buildings today are gone and have been replaced by what you see here, Wendy's and the Licking County Administration Building. So that side of the square is pretty much entirely changed from what it is now. We'll see later the other half of the east side of the square, just for some comparison. So it's pretty much entirely changed. We are lucky that the other 3 sides of the square are still pretty intact. There's a good number of the historic buildings that are still there, but unfortunately the east side has not fared well. So since we were talking about hotels, the Warden Hotel, let's move on to another hotel. This was another very well-known hotel, another pretty large hotel in downtown Newark. This was the Sherwood Hotel. Later on in life, it would be called the Taft Hotel. So you might remember it as that. Sherwood Hotel was built right around the turn of the 20th century. And it was located on East Main Street and First Street. So as you can see here, it actually faced First Street. And this confuses a lot of people because if you remember the Taft Hotel, this isn't really what it looks like because this is not the side that was visible anymore because it originally fronted on First Street. However, you can see this is what most people would remember. In 1920, the post office built that building there on the corner, which is still there. And that effectively blocked what was originally the front of the hotel. So there is an entrance on the side, on the north end of the hotel, which would enter from East Main Street. But the original front was facing First Street, as you can see. So unfortunately, this building was torn down. It suffered a fire in the early 80s, which was pretty devastating, and it ended up being torn down because of that. If you drive past there today, the site is just a parking lot. Yet another hotel, one of many, and there are still several hotels in downtown New York that survive, of course. But of course, this presentation, we're talking about all buildings which have been torn down. This is the Hotel Seiler. This building was located on South 2nd Street on the corner of what's now Scheidler and South 2nd. It wasn't around for very long. This was built in 1900, and it was only lasted until 1939. So just about 40 years. It later became called the Central Hotel. This is a picture really not of the hotel, but this is of the construction of what they called the subways, which are the underpasses under the railroad. Now, you go under the hill or go down a little hill and go under the railroad, but that was originally all flat. So that was dug out to be built like that so that you didn't have to stop for the trains. If you've ever wondered why that's higher, why the sidewalks are higher like that. But you can see to the side, the sign that says Central Hotel. This picture is dated 1930. So this is just about 10 years before this building was torn down. Nowadays, if you go there, it's the site of Job and Family Services. Job and Family Services is actually in a building that was built after the demolition of the Hotel Seiler, which was originally, I believe, an A&P grocery store. So it's got some history on it too, actually. You wouldn't look at it and necessarily think that. But that is what is now on the site of the Hotel Seiler. And you can see, though, how there's that little sort of road in front of those, which would have been the natural ground level before they dug out the underpasses. So this is one that I would be very surprised if too many people recognize. This is a building that I tried for a really long time to find a picture of, because all I had ever seen was a very close picture of a man sitting on the front step. You couldn't see too much about the building, but I knew about it and I knew what it was, but I just didn't have much more information about it. So this is what was originally the Hotel Ludlow. So this was yet another hotel. But for many people, it was more associated for a longer time with the Salvation Army. So this was the Salvation Army Citadel from just after World War I until 1952. In 1952, the building was actually condemned. So the Salvation Army needed to move out. So they moved, at that point, they moved to what had been the former Chris Brothers funeral home on West Main Street, which is now the Licking County Players Theater. That building is still there. Of course, the Salvation Army is now out on East Main Street. But for about 35 years, they were in this building, the Hotel Ludlow. Here's another picture of it again. Just to give you can actually see in the window, if you see that left window, the Salvation Army office. This picture, judging by the cars, is probably 1930s, maybe. I'm not a car expert, so you might know better than me, but the building's pretty cool. It's got some really neat details to it. I love that sort of curved bay window in the center. Unfortunately, of course, like as I said, the building was condemned in 1955, and it was torn down shortly after, or 1952, I think, is when it was condemned. The Salvation Army moved to their location after this in 1954. So the building would have been torn down at some point after that. This is another view. a very good view of the building, but to give you some idea where it was located, it was on 4th Street, just north of West Main. And unfortunately, it's obscured by the bell tower on what was the fire station. But you can see here in the red box, that's actually the building. So the buildings on either side of it still remain, as you can see here in this picture. So now there is a one-story building that's in its place, but it occupied that gap there on 4th Street. Some of you might actually remember, if anybody does remember that building, I'd love to know if it's something that you remember. Some of these things you might see and it might jog your memory, something that you haven't thought about in a long time. So I would definitely be happy to hear, even if you remember the building, whether or not you have memories about it or not, just if it's something that's familiar to you. And we just mentioned the fire station, so let's go ahead and talk about that. Of course, that's another building that is no longer around. This was not just the fire station, but this was also the city administration offices. So this was essentially City Hall. This building was built in 1853. Originally, it was built as a market house, but in the late 1850s, the city offices moved into the 2nd floor, and of course, eventually they took over the building. So the fire station was housed here. If you see, there's a smaller brick building behind there, which was the police station. Here we've got a really cool picture of the police patrol drawn by horses, of course. And this picture is a little bit grainy, but this is a picture from, I believe the year on this one is 1958. So this is a more recent picture, but the building was torn down in the early 1960s in order to build what is now the current city administration building. So this is the view today of the building that's there. The building had really become outgrown by the city offices. As you can imagine, it's housing all of the administration offices as well as fire department. There's a lot of need for space. So the city had moved out of the building, and I think that the building itself was just needing too many repairs for them to stay in there. So the city offices actually moved around a couple of places. They even occupied the Hotel Warden after it had closed. But as you can imagine, it's difficult to move all those filing cabinets and all that kind of stuff. But I think they tried for a while to get the funding in place to build their own building again, or a new building. And then this current building was built, I think it opened, I don't have the date in front of me. I think it was 1967, I want to say, but it was in the mid-1960s, designed by a local architect, Julius Blom. However, it did not originally have that top protruding part. It was just 3 floors, and so it looked quite different than it does now. That top floor really changed the entire look of the building. This is another building that you might recognize. I see a lot of things on Facebook. A lot of times people will say, I remember that building. I went to school in that building. But that's getting confused with the building that's still there. But this building was Newark High School, built in 1889. As you can see, it's around there. Don't quote me on that date. Actually, now I'm having second thoughts. A lot of the times I do these presentations pretty much from memory. So if I mess up a date, my apologies. Every once in a while, I'll tell somebody the wrong date, and then I correct myself if I realize I'm wrong. So if you know it was a different date, feel free to email me. Anyway, so this is Newark High School. This was actually designed, I believe, by F.W. Yost, who had designed the jail, the old Newark jail as well. This building is really cool looking. Looks sort of castle-ish, and I think it's a really neat building. It wasn't that large though. So just after the turn of the century, around 1908, they added on a wing to the west, as you can see here. So that building was really cool because that had an observatory on the top, lots of space. A lot of people probably do remember that one. I'm sure several people remember going to classes that were in that part of the building. This view you can see here, this is from the Regalia, I think the 1927, 1928 school year. Really great picture of the school. Located on West Main Street, just between 5th and 6th. And here's another view. Eventually, though, that original part with all the spires, they decided that they needed to update it and enlarge it, although it wasn't very old. So in 1939, they actually started the demolition of that portion of the building. As you can see here. So hence why I question anyone who says they remember going to that school, because you would have to be, not that you couldn't have, but you'd have to be probably around 97 to have been a freshman before that was happening. So, but if you do remember, good, that's awesome. I'd like to know your secret to long life. However, afterwards, this building was constructed. So here we see the construction of the building that's still there. Of course, it's no longer Newark High School, but this is the current building under construction. They built it in the spot of the original one, still attached to the wing that was built in 1908. Here you can kind of see how they're attached. You can also get a good sense of the scale of that addition. You can see the observatory on top. Really cool that they had that. Of course, eventually that would become sort of obsolete because it's difficult to have an observatory in the middle of a city with all the lights and everything like that. So as Newark grew, as more things became electrified, that obviously became less and less usable. But it was cool nonetheless. And then again, here's a good view so you can see how these two buildings were attached. So eventually in the 1960s, once Newark High School moved to its current location, in the late 1960s, they started to demolish the 1908 West Addition. And today, this is what survives of the school. So this was then used, it was an elementary school for a while. Now it's, this is a Google picture from a couple of years ago, but this is now apartments. So the building is still there, still in really great shape. It was renovated, still standing, and it is, you can still see it, but this is where the old high school was that we looked at. Speaking of schools, let's go one street north. This is Old Central. So this was Newark's probably first permanent, solely dedicated school building. Before this, there were school buildings, obviously, but they were generally multi-use. They would either take place in a church, or they would also serve as a church or serve multiple functions, be in the room at another building or something like that. This one was built around 1850, I want to say, on West Church Street. And it served, I think, all grades until the new high school was built in the 1880s, and then it became a school for the younger students who weren't yet in high school. This building lasted until 1949, and that's when they realized the need to do school, as you can see here. So Central School got an upgrade. Over the years, it's gone by a couple of different names. It was Kennedy for a while. And then once it stopped being a middle school for New York City schools, it's had some other uses. It was Eagle Wings Academy. It's right now Phoenix Central is the name of the school. So it is still active as a school, still standing on West Church Street. This one is one that you might also remember, but likely not like this. This is the B&O Passenger Depot. So the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was a major component of Newark's history. It was a big employer in the area. Newark was a hub for the B&O. The B&O Roundhouse was just south of East Main Street, across the river from from the depot. I still talk to a lot of people who worked for the B&O, who worked at the yard, at the roundhouse. A lot of memories of the B&O. Newark's connection to the railroads started in the 1850s, the early 1850s. Between 1852 and 1856, I think we saw the development of 4 different rail lines. Eventually, we had 5 rail lines coming through just Newark. That's not Licking County. There were more throughout the county. But through Newark itself, there were 5 different rail lines. By the mid-1860s, 4 of those have been consolidated into the Baltimore, Ohio Railroad. The other one remained separate, the Pennsylvania Railroad. Pennsylvania Station is still standing downtown. It's on Walnut Street between 2nd and 3rd. However, this was the B&O passenger depot. I do have an inside picture of it too, which I always like to share if I have one. No smoking, it says. It's sort of progressive for the time. And look at the tile floors. Lots of really cool details. I love the light fixtures in there. Pretty neat to see inside of a building. To give you some idea of the layout, now this is a Sanborn Map. If you've seen my presentations, you might be familiar with these. So we can see here, this is the Licking River. Here is the canal, and here's First Street. So if we were to continue beyond the map, East Main Street would be up here, beyond the edge. So this was on First Street, and there's a triangle here, sort of rails, and the station set in the center of those. This building obviously became unused after the B&O went out, and passenger rail lines weren't really a thing anymore, at least to the extent that they were. This passenger depot obviously was not used anymore. So it became really derelict. And in the 1980s, it was used as a controlled burn for training for the fire department. So it was burnt down and it's no longer there. To give you a little bit of a better idea of where it is. So here is actually the works. If you're familiar with where we are, this is First Street. This is Schuyler Street. Our parking lot is here, and the depot was right over here. So it's near where the former 911 call center was, just sort of behind Speedway, back in that area on off of East Main Street. This is a building that you might recognize if you watched my presentation on theaters. This is actually the first theater to have been built in Newark. This was the Newark Opera House. This was built in 1865, and it was located on West Main Street, right next to what was for a long time the Sparta, which is now Elliott's restaurant downtown. This building was built in 1865 by George Wallace, and it was had an opera house upstairs, had businesses in the bottom. It remained, it didn't continue to be an opera house, but the building remained until 1957. Here's a better view of the entrance. So you can see it was actually on the 2nd floor was where the stage was. And you can see the words over that doorway, Opera House. Neat little ticket booth. Very cool looking building. But as I said, it was torn down. This gives you actually a good idea of some of the details that were on the front of the building. Unfortunately, they're being disassembled, but there was a lot of cool ornamentation on the front of the building. As I said, it was torn down in 1957. It was because the arcade, which is still downtown, extended. It had a portion that extended to West Main Street, an arcade annex, which was on one side of this building. And at the time, the Newark Trust bank that was in the skyscraper was installing a drive-through bank thing, which at the time was new and very revolutionary. but they needed a drive-through. They didn't actually have a place for people to drive up to the bank. So what they did was tore down this building so that cars could drive in and do their drive-up banking. So unfortunately, this building was lost to that effort. But this was also surrounded by other buildings that were lost. Here's another picture. And you can see that arcade. It says Arcade Hotel and Restaurant there. This is West Main Street. Here we have what was the Sparta. You can actually see Elliott Hardware, which is where Elliott's got its name from. So here's the Newark Opera House building. Hopefully everybody can see my mouse cursor. But just west of it were also buildings that are no longer there. So this is called the Schaller Block. Of course, you can see the date, built in 1912. I don't know exactly what's going on here. It looks like a tightrope walker is about to maybe walk across, either across the street or just on top of the building. Something very exciting going on nonetheless. These buildings were purchased by the city when they were building the city administration building, and they were torn down for that because they were in the way. So this is the view nowadays of where all of those buildings were. Another theater is the Grand Theater. And as I mentioned, the three sides of the square are pretty intact. And this is on one of those sides that's pretty much almost entirely old, except for a few gaps. And this Grand Theater is in the space of one of those gaps. It was also the Boston dry goods store for quite a long time. The Grand Theater was owned by the Price family, and they opened it in 1919, purchased it in 1919, and it operated until 1954. Here's a picture of the marquee. This photo from around 1920 gives you a good view of the front of the building. It was a pretty neat building because, as you can see, stylistically, it was a little bit different from the rest on that side of the square. Got quite a large sort of almost Second Empire-ish roof on the front. A very neat building, though, nonetheless. As I said, the theater closed in 1954. The building was torn down in 1972 and was just a vacant lot. Here's the picture of the inside of the theater. Of course, now when we say theater, this was a movie theater. At the time, movie theaters were just often one screen or one room where they would show the same thing. So there were multiple theaters around town, this being one of them. And this is what's there today. In 1989, an office building was built for Wachtel and McAnally architects. And I believe they're still there, and that's still used as their office. So this is really the only new construction on the entire south side of the square. The other buildings that are there are 1870s at the most recent. Another theater, Lyric Theater, and this is actually going to take us on a whole view of South 3rd Street. So we can see the Lyric Theater there on the left. It was another small movie theater. A small building that housed a few different things. And then we have an alley. And then there's a larger building in the center. That was actually the Franklin Bank. And we'll look at these buildings individually here. So this is the Franklin Bank. Also had a hotel. You can see the sign Hotel Franklin. Smith the artist is something that you see in a lot of old Newark pictures. And he was a photographer. So he had had his studio a little bit further north on 3rd Street next to the Trust building. But when they built the Hall building, he moved into the Franklin Bank building. There were also several other things in this building, other stores and things like that. In 1913, the building suffered a pretty bad fire, this is a picture after the fire. And a little bit later, you can see another picture. Eventually, that building was torn down and it was replaced by this one here. That was home to W.T. Grant department store. Grants also renovated the building across the alley from them. They didn't have quite enough space in just that one. So in the 1950s, they renovated this building. And here's another view from sort of the square. And I do apologize if I'm moving through these too quickly. As I said, I've got a ton of slides and I want to get through all of them. So if you have any questions about anything that I didn't spend enough time on, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information will be available at the end of the presentation. Unfortunately, all of those buildings are gone. There were a couple of waves of fires which wiped them out. As recently as the 90s, early 90s, there were some fires. Candlewick Commons was built, I think, in 1996 or somewhere in the late 90s, which is this building here. It's an apartment building for older adults, and that was built on the site of where the Franklin Bank was and where Grants had been. And of course, now there's a parking lot across the alley where the other buildings were that we looked at. Unfortunately, Newark has had quite a lot of fires that have shaped the downtown area. A lot of time, we see pictures of cool buildings, or we see gaps in our downtown landscape, and you think, why would they ever tear that down? But a lot of the time, it's because there was a fire. So it wasn't anyone's choice to tear things down a lot of the time. Sometimes they just caught fire, which has been the case with a lot of things in downtown Newark. This is another building that a lot of you probably won't recognize, but I think it's pretty cool because this building is rarely pictured. And in fact, this part of downtown is hard to find pictures of from this era. But this is the Licking County Savings Bank. This was located on 3rd Street, sort of across from where the old YMCA was. The Licking County Savings was chartered in 1900, December 12, 1900. They were originally located on North Park Place, but then in 1902, they moved their office to 32 North 3rd Street. Eventually, in 1936, they moved into this building, which was meant to look like a Tudor-style English counting house. And they stayed here in this building, until the mid-1950s, when they actually built a new building. This is another view. I believe this is from the sesquicentennial in 1952. You can see the front is slightly different. The building is here in the center. Looks a little bit different than it did before. Possibly some renovation. But then in the mid-1950s, it was torn down. And this is the building that was built in its place. So this was the upgraded Licking County Savings, which opened in 1956. And eventually became Huntington, was most recently Huntington Bank. Of course, now there's nothing in there, but that was Licking County Savings. And they've been on that spot for quite a long time, since 1936. But I like to show that picture because it's not really a building that you see very often. And I don't know in many other pictures of it. This is another picture or another building that was once on the downtown square. I had mentioned earlier, we were talking about the east side, south of East Main. Well, this is just north of East Main on 2nd Street, on the corner of 2nd Street and East Main. This is called the Hebert and Shouse building. This occupied the corner. It had a lot of different uses over the time. It was department stores for pretty much its entire existence. You can see at the top there, YMCA. So it was a temporary home of the YMCA before they built the building on the corner of 3rd and Church. That's still there. Dry goods stores, quite a few different stores that were in it at the time. Some of the most famous residents, the J.C. Company. J.C. Penney's was located here from the 1930s until it moved out to Southgate in the 1960s. Also, Scott's Furniture was a very long time inhabitant of the Hebert and Shouse building. Of course, there were other buildings that were attached to it as well. The Carousel Restaurant is a famous building that was on that side, and that was near there. Unfortunately, as we can see from this view, really all the buildings that are pictured here, you can see here, except for the spire of the church, but as far as the ones on 2nd Street are all gone. And pretty much all of that has to do, again, with fire. As you can see here, this building suffered a devastating fire in the 70s. I think it was around 1977. You can see Scott's Furniture sign. You can sort of see the sign for Carousel Restaurant. Really just devastated the entire building. As you can see, the roof is gone and went through the whole building. So unfortunately, this building was also torn down. It's a really neat style, sort of Romanesque looking, but it was destroyed by fire. So now on that spot, First Federal Bank is there. First Federal Savings and Loan. It was had moved from, it had occupied the original Park National Bank location, which is next to the Midland. And after the destruction of the Hebert and Shouse building, they purchased the property and they built this building where they are now. So as you can tell, the east side of the square has changed entirely. And really that's the only side of the square that's seen that much change. Of course, some other buildings here and there have been demolished around the square. Not so many new things built, but a couple of new buildings have been built, newer buildings have been built. But really on the east side, it's been entirely changed. So that is my presentation. I'm happy to say we kept it right about an hour. I was worried because, as I said, there were a ton of slides in this one. So because there were so many, I know I might have sped through some things. So please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. My phone number is there, as well as my email address. You can always feel welcome to reach out to me with any questions that you have. I will do my best to get back to you. Sometimes I get sort of loaded down with doing research for different people or with projects. So I will do my best to get back to you as timely as I can, but I will be happy to answer questions for you if I can answer them for you. And if not, then I will try to figure out the answer. With that said, if anybody has any questions right now that they would like to ask, feel free to use the chat box and ask me anything if you have questions right now. And I appreciate all of your feedback. I appreciate your attendance. As I said, it's fun to be able to do these, and we have been now for almost a year, we've been doing these History at Home presentations. So there's quite a few that you can see that have been recorded. As I said, this one's also being recorded, and it will be posted later on our YouTube channel, which we also share a link to on Facebook. So keep an eye out for that. If you didn't get to catch all of it, or if you hear somebody saying that they wish they could have attended, please share it with them. Find the link, find our YouTube channel, and pass it along. As I said, it will be posted so that you can watch it again if you want. So it says, what's the story on the Louis Sullivan? Did you mean the Louis Sullivan, the building, or on Louis Sullivan himself? Louis Sullivan was a really well-known architect. He is fairly prolific. He was Chicago-based. There are quite a few buildings in Chicago that were designed by him. He wanted to create an architectural style that was uniquely American. So many of our architecture is classical inspired from Europe. So you have revival, Gothic revival, Greek revival, classical revival, all of these things, very European styles. But he wanted to create uniquely American styles. So he drew inspiration from nature, from natural motifs, repeating patterns, highly ornamented things. And so he wanted to build buildings that reflected that. One of the big projects that he's well known for is the jewel box banks that he built. And we're lucky enough to have one of them in Newark. He built not that many, maybe 9 banks throughout the Midwest in Ohio. I don't even know all the states they're in, Indiana, Iowa. They're all sort of within the central Midwest, but there's not that many. There's only one other in Ohio. And ours is pretty unique because it's the only one that's fully covered in terracotta. And there's a lot of really ornate mosaic work. There's leaded glass. There's opalescent glass. The interior was very, very highly decorated with lots of stenciling, lots of gold leaf, incredibly ornamental. That building, if you've gotten a chance to drive past it recently, looks really incredible now. It's in the midst of undergoing a complete restoration. It's owned by the Licking County Foundation, and it was donated to them several years ago now. And they've received a lot of support locally, but also from groups that seek to make sure that Sullivan architecture is preserved. So they have done completed 2 phases of the restoration. They've completed the basement section, and then they completed the exterior restoration. That included rebuilding the corner of the building, which at some point had been removed to put in a corner door. So they redid the entrance. They had to have all of the terracotta cleaned. There were several that were broken, so they had to have them custom made, which was a process because there were only 2 manufacturers in the country who even still did that. And so they had to do a color match. There was restoration of all the mosaic tile. The windows were taken out and redone. I was actually fortunate enough to get to go to the stained glass studio, which is just outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where those windows were sent. And I got to actually go to the studio while the windows were there and see them and get a tour of the whole process of what was happening. So everything was done expertly. The craftsmanship on the building was incredible. And so the restoration had to also match that level. So it's been a really extensive process. They're getting ready to work on the interior. So I think it'll probably take I don't know what their timeline is, but another year or 2 before it's fully finished. But then at that point, it will be home to Explore Licking County. It'll serve as a visitor center. So the bottom floor will be open so that everyone can go in and see, because it's absolutely magnificent on the inside. So hopefully that answered your question. If anybody else has any questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, again, you're welcome to email me or give me a phone call at the office, but both of my phone number and my email address are available there. And thank you so much for joining me. There's a lot of things you could be doing on a Thursday evening, so I'm glad you chose to spend your evening with me. Keep an eye on our social media for any future programs that are coming out. We have been doing History at Home every month, as well as Side-Home at Home. We have a variety of other events and programs coming up, so you can find us on Facebook. Check out our website at theworks.org, or pick up one of our program guides to see what's coming up next. We will be having our next History at Home will be next month. The theme of that one will be Made in Licking County. So we'll be talking about the Worley Stove Factory and the American Bottle Company. You won't want to miss that. Those were pretty interesting things. So keep an eye out for the registration for that one. In the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful spring, and I will see you then.